Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Penelope Roskell, and this is our first Q&A session on Facebook. Welcome to everybody, wherever you are in the world. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. I've had quite a number of questions that have been submitted in advance, so I will be responding to those one after the other. And the first question came in from Julianne. And she says, I'm teaching Bumble Boogie by Jack Fina. Now, for those of you who don't know this piece, it actually uses the flight of the bumblebee in the right hand with a boogie bass in the left, which is why it's called Bumble Boogie. And it consists of a lot of unremitting octave span work in the left hand. How do I teach this so there's minimal tension in the forearm or anywhere else? At the same time, the right hand consists mainly of fast high treble work. So one is not necessarily optimally seated for the low octave work. In playing through, I found my left forearm was tensing up. How do I teach a student what I'm looking for to prevent tension or potential injury? She says, I'm still working through your course and book and haven't yet reached the section on octaves. She says the student is 13 years old, he's tall, has a good hand span, can play eighths and ninths, but no more. So that's really useful information, Julianne, and it's an interesting question, which in a way has three parts. By the way, the first thing I would say is I think once you get to that section in my book, The Complete Pianist, or you'll also find this, there is a lot of this in the section of my piano teacher's course, Teaching Healthy Expressive Technique. So I would look at the octave section and also at page 495. Now that may seem an odd section to go to. It's about teaching pianists with smaller hands. Now I know your student hasn't got particularly small hands, but he hasn't got large hands. And what we're talking about here is trying to minimize the stretch that we're at so we don't get tired. So that would also be a useful section for you to study. So the first question is, your question was about seating. Because they're doing the flight of the bumblebee up here and the octaves are quite low down, how do you manage that? Now, what I find when I've got both hands at quite the extremes of the piano, I don't align the hand and the finger with the keys. I'm not trying to do this, because in order to do that I'd have to reach over and then I wouldn't be able to reach the left hand. So what I'm doing is my hand is a little bit at an angle to the keys, so I'm thinking more of the third finger still being in line with the arm. So when you come down and you're doing bass notes, what happens is that the thumb just moves a little bit further in towards the black notes, so that then the hand still feels fairly comfortable, even when you're fairly low down. So that will keep everything not in alignment with the keys, but in alignment with the arm. So the arm should feel fairly comfortable. Now, at the beginning, we have a left-hand section which goes like this. So you can see it's a boogie type of accompaniment. Now, there is a tendency for all pianists, when they see something which has got octaves in it, to stay with the hand open at the full stretch, and so you're likely to get quite tired. So also, this is marked legato in the left hand. I wouldn't actually play it and aim for a real legato. You want to have it a little bit of a jazzy sort of feel, so a little bit. I wouldn't aim for a perfect legato. So what I would be doing there is starting with a fifth, not with my hand fully out, but just and then open out to the thumb. So I'm almost jumping off from one to the other actually. So and then I'm ready for this. And then I just quickly open out my hand. And I can do that with a little bit of a jump. So at no point do I feel really uncomfortably stretched. Now, the next section that Julianne brought up was one which has a lot of what I call broken octaves, split octaves, again in the bass. And it goes like this. forte. So it can, if it's going on for a long time, it can get quite tiring. So I think if a student is finding that quite tiring, what I would start with is just some basic rotation work. So what we're trying to do is to improve their rotational freedom, their ability to rotate freely. So the first thing I would do is just do a very loose, floppy rotation. I've called this various names over the years. I call it pizza dough, pastry dough. More recently, I've called it brachium emendi, which is a spell that was put on Harry Potter, which meant that his arms lost the bones, and so his arm went completely floppy. And so we can just get the feeling that the arm is very, very relaxed. And then from then on, I would start to teach them to do just a very medium dynamic, medium tempo rotation at the interval of a fifth. So we just do, and always do a short little group so that they can relax in between. There's no time for them to become tense. And then eventually start to build up to the sixth, and then the seventh, and then the octave. Now, so wait until the student can do this quite comfortably at the octave in just a medium dynamic. Now, the thing is, when you want to play forte in a split octave, you have to be very careful not to put pressure down into the keys and to start to do this. Firstly, it doesn't sound very nice, and secondly, it really puts pressure on the arms. So, again, Julianne, you'll find a lot about this in the rotation section of the book when you get to that. But when we want a forte rotation, what we do is we do a more energetic rotation. So we do more of this movement and that movement, that's more energetic, not pressing down into the keys. So it feels... rather than... See, that also feels a bit heavy and chunky. So I hope, Julianne, that will help you and your student. Jose. Now again, the questions have all come from people who have completed my Piano Teachers online course. So Jose says, this question pertains to a specific topic found in both Teaching Healthy Expressive Piano Technique and your book, The Complete Pianist. The singing finger touch. I am not completely certain as to how to practice this touch myself, so I can teach it with conviction to others. Would you be so kind as to review what one should look for when it comes to movement and configuration of the fingers when this touch is correctly implemented? It's strange, isn't it? This is the most natural, the most simple finger touch, and yet it seems very confusing when people first think about it. Now, those of you who are teachers who are listening in today will find that some of your students are naturally doing this touch. It is the most natural movement for the finger. But, so you may only need to teach this touch to somebody who has developed certain imbalances, who's not using their finger to the best of its ability. So, any pianist, for instance, who has a tendency to do a lot of movement from this joint will probably need to learn this touch, because that movement is very difficult to control because it's not going straight down, it's going at an oblique angle, and it's difficult to control when the sound is going to be sounded. So, so this is also very useful for a student who's got very weak joints, the MCP joints, the knuckles. So if it's a young student who's got very weak hands, or if it's somebody who's hypermobile, this exercise is very useful for them. Now, so it's a very compact finger action, it's very natural, and it's using the intrinsic hand muscles, which are here around this area. And each finger has its own set of intrinsic hand muscles, so if you use these muscles, you're actually really developing the independence of the finger. You're not only doing that, you're also strengthening the hand arch. So, now, what the intrinsic muscles do, and I hope, Jose, by going over it again now and explaining it perhaps in a little bit more detail in a different way, it may become clearer. The intrinsic muscles do a very interesting thing. They bend this joint. Now, again, if I were to do that, I would again be hitting the note obliquely. I'd come down that way, and then I'd have to come back up again. So it actually takes a little bit of effort. Now, the wonderful thing about the intrinsic hand muscles is they bend this joint, and at the same time, they slightly extend this joint here. So it's doing that movement. Now you might think, if you were to say that very consciously to a student, I'm explaining that to you because, Jose, I know you're a teacher and you want to understand the sort of principles behind it. But the reason why I teach it to my students first on my knee is because it shows them how easy this movement is and how natural it is. So what I ask them to do is to just take each finger in turn and slide it down their leg. Right? And if I do it with this hand, you'll see it a bit more clearly that what's happening is this is bending and this is actually straightening. So very, very naturally, it's doing precisely the movement that we want to do to press a key from the key surface down to the key bed. So that movement is precisely the movement that you would do on the piano to depress a note. And it's a very economical movement because it's only moving from there to the key bed. So it's very easy to control. There's none of this movement going on. So it's actually the simplest way to play the piano. Now, it's worth doing a lot of extra work on the fourth and fifth finger. So you'll just be stretching it down in each way because this tends to be the joints that are weak with most students. And don't ask them to do lots and lots of these all in one go. They can just take it step by step. They can just do a few a day at the beginning. The important thing is that they keep their forearm really relaxed, that there's no tension, they're not working it too hard. So the idea is to keep the fingers learning to do a very independent movement so that the forearm isn't getting tired. And so those are the two fingers that will need a lot more work. Now, the one last thing I want to say is that sometimes people confuse this exercise and they think it's all about lifting the finger up high and then putting it back down again. And that again tends to tire things unnecessarily. All we need to do to play the piano is to depress the key. That's the only effort we need to make. So in this, we're actually focusing on pushing down, the finger down, stretching it, elongating it, and it comes back by itself. It comes back to its normal position. So the effort is just in stretching your finger down your leg and then onto the keys. And so you can use that in any passage that just has independent finger touch. So a Mozart passage. So each finger, so if I do it in the left hand, in a very tiny, very subtle way, this is bending, this one's opening out. Now, Cheryl has asked, which techniques would you focus on when teaching a beginner? That's quite a big question. There's a whole book in there. But I'll just summarise it, and I hope you can look them up a little bit further when you've got some more time. And in fact, this question also leads into the next question, which I'll come into in a minute. So I think, Cheryl, the most important thing is to balance the needs of note reading and note learning with maintaining freedom of movement around the piano. Now, I'm currently writing some books for beginners. They're technique books for beginners. They're going to be available in the autumn, and I'm putting into practice my beliefs, the principles I work according to with technique, and trying to show how right from the beginning we can put into good practice all the techniques which will stand them then in good stead right the way through the rest of their piano playing career. So I think one of the first things they need is to have the feeling that they've got a lot of freedom around the keyboard, that they're not only playing in that middle C position. You see what happens if I'm playing in the middle C position. My hand is a little bit twisted outwards, it's called honor deviation. My elbows are pulled in tight towards the body. My shoulders, instead of being wide and open, they come in and they go up a little bit. So you don't want to be stuck only in that position for the first few months of playing the piano. So you want to acquire some lateral freedom. So I think, doing anything where you're just perhaps moving around, even going right up to the top, playing black notes, playing white notes, maybe just doing one note. Finding the Ds. Any exercise that you're playing, and it's written in the book, in C major. In my books I've had a real conflict because I'm saying to myself, all the students will be learning their notes on C major, so how do I reconcile that with the idea of using the whole keyboard? So with a lot of the exercises I write them in C major, and around the middle C area, but I say play it an octave higher or play it an octave lower, so that you're in a much better and more comfortable position. And I use a lot of black notes and moving around the keyboard, which we do by rote. So the teacher is showing the student, and then the student copies it. I think it's important to start non-legato, because I think it's very difficult particularly for a young student or somebody with weak fingers, to play legato immediately. What tends to happen is it's quite hard for them to press the keys down, so they end up doing this. And if some of the fingers come up and they do all sorts of strange hand positions, or this arch dips down, all sorts of things can start to go wrong. So I start with a non-legato touch, maybe just with one finger. I'll talk about that in a minute when we come to Gemma's question. And then I introduce an exercise that I call the parachute touch. With that, we're just learning to use gravity. So the idea is the hand comes up like a balloon, and then it just comes down. You imagine it's a parachute or a cat hanging from a parachute, and you just land on the keys in just single notes or in chords. And that's teaching gravity. So you're just dropping into the keys, you're not pressing into the keys. This we can then continue into longer legato melodies. We can start to combine it into slurs and with staccatos, so they're what I call down up hop hop. So we've got down up. So we're just starting initially by just doing a slur. So we could do a Now, if you look closely at what I'm doing there, I'm coordinating my whole arm and my hand and my finger in one movement. So the arm comes down, the wrist comes up, and the arm follows. And so each of these movements that we're learning right from the beginning are well coordinated movements. They're actually using the whole arm, so the arm supports the finger in everything it does. And I think if you can establish that freedom of movement right from the start, then you'll solve hundreds of problems that might have occurred later. You'll avoid all these problems. You'll give them a really sound technique which will last them for years. And it's also a musical technique because it interprets everything in exactly the way you want it to be. So for instance, that down up, it becomes a minuet. So we're learning all the movements which will help them to play expressively. And the third thing I would focus on, really from quite an early stage, is a few strengthening exercises. And by that, I don't necessarily mean doing a lot of 5-finger exercises on the piano when the hands maybe aren't quite strong enough for it. I have one which I think is great for children, which all you're doing is you're just bending from here. And I call it nitter, natter, bitter, batter, jitter, jatter, all day long. And you can make up tunes, you can make up words. I use crocodiles and ducks and things. And this is exercising those muscles, the intrinsic hand muscles that we've just been talking about, so that when they do come to do more complex things on the piano, the hands will be that little bit stronger. So, Cheryl, I hope that's helpful. Those are the main things I would really focus on initially, and then obviously that will develop and be refined and used for other techniques later on. Now, the next question comes from Gemma. Gemma has done my piano teacher's course, but she's also had quite a lot of lessons in the past with me as a one-to-one student. So she's going into quite a lot of detail here. She loves to understand the detail, which is great for a piano teacher to do. She always worries that she overthinks things, but actually her questions are always very sensible. She's asked a question about a technique I describe in the new books that I'm writing for beginners, because she's seen a draft of it. She would like clarification of the difference between the parachute touch and a technique I call balloon bobbing. She asked, the balloon bobbing, this is not using a hanging wrist, as in the parachute touch, more that the arm and hand are moving as one unit, as in, say, a relaxed forearm staccato, with the arm behind each finger. From everything I've learned from you, this seems to be a good touch to use at the beginning. So that's the first part of the question, which actually, I think you've got it spot on there, Gemma. So I just start, as I said, with a detached touch at the beginning. It can help to put the thumb behind this joint, because that will strengthen it so that they don't end up playing in that way. So they just have a nice firm finger to land on. And I just introduced the bobbing technique quite early on, because it helps to give them the sound, gives a good sound quality, it gives them the sense of bouncing in and out of the notes, a fairly light arm and a well-coordinated arm. So it's got a bit of a bounce, comes straight out again. And yes, it's a well-coordinated arm-hand movement. Not a lot of wrist movement, but a bit of give. Now, she then goes on to say, so if I understand correctly, the more relaxed hanging wrist comes in with the parachuting exercise, or the parachuting puss exercise. And again, Gemma, you've got that absolutely right. So the parachute exercise, and I know a lot of people who've worked on these exercises with me, or through the book or whatever, or the course, I want to make it clear for everybody that these are all very similar. They all use gravity, but they produce a slightly different sound. Now, once we start to use the parachute touch, what it does is it produces a beautiful cantabile sound. So it leads into legato playing and cantabile playing. And you're absolutely right, Gemma. When you come into a parachute, what you do is you really focus as you come up on relaxing the wrist, so the hand can hang. It's very, very relaxed. And then as you come down, there is a little bit of give in the wrist in that way. And that's what cushions the impact of the hand on the keyboard and really softens and warms the sound, which is quite different from landing in that harsh way. So yes, as you hot air balloon up, your hand is hanging, it's very relaxed. As you come down, the hand will naturally dip a little bit and then come back. But just like the bobbing technique, it's also using a fully coordinated use of the whole arm and hand. Now, Gemma then came back to me with a second question. And again, I think it's a very interesting one. It's quite advanced sort of technique here. She says it concerns forward and backwards movements. Now, I do talk quite a lot about forward and backwards movements, and a lot of pianists tend to forget about this aspect of piano playing, so I think it's worth bringing in here. In fast passages, when we're alternating between black and white notes, and she gives an example of the Beethoven Waldstein Sonata, how much forward and back is appropriate to use in a passage like this? Now, she sort of answered it herself, but I'll tell you what she says. My understanding is that it's helpful to minimize forward and backward movements, keep evenly curved fingers, and so to be playing the whole thing quite further forward with fingers in between the black notes. But is there a use for some forward and back movements to keep the arm free? Also, it seems harder for me to play between the black notes when you have to put a finger over to join two white notes, as the finger has to reach over a black note too. Yeah, now that might be a bit much to take in as I'm just reading it, but I'll show you in slow motion the passage that she's talking about, and you'll see what I mean here. So it's much faster than this, but it's just this. And then you've got some black notes, then some white notes, another black note. And this whole long passage has some black notes, some white notes. Now, I think there's a fairly easy way to explain this. Now, say I'm playing something which is only on white notes, then naturally my hand will be a little bit nearer to the edge of the keys, so that I can fit everything in, but I need to get the thumb and the fifth finger on the notes for now, yeah? So my wrist tends to be a little bit lower, and I'm a little further back. Now, if I was then to play G major scale, I'm not ready for the F sharp. So if I'm in that position, I might be tempted to stretch out one finger. Now, if you were to try playing the piano in that position for a long period of time, you'd find it very uncomfortable. It's not fast, it's not comfortable. So we want to keep the fingers evenly curved as much as possible, as Gemma said. So then if I want to add in one black note, I will, instead of being here on the edge of the keys, I'll move a little bit further in. So if I'm doing D major, for instance, right hand, I'm going to bring it in a little bit further. So my thumb is sort of a little bit further in than it was on the C major. So no black notes, you'll be quite near the edge. One black note, you'll be a little bit further in. Now, if you've got a lot of black notes and your thumb is playing a black note, then obviously you have to be further in again. So if I'm doing something in F sharp major, see my hand here is, my fingers are actually touching the floorboard there, so I've really come far in. So, Gemma, in this passage, I would probably start a little bit back in C major, then I would probably just reach over. Now here, you're right, you don't want to be too far in, because then you've got to get your finger over. So, sorry. So at this point, I'm going to bring my hand back a bit, and then I'm going to be forward a bit again. So I'm ready for the black note on the E flat. So I hope that's absolutely clear. It all really depends on what your thumb is doing. If you're in C major, your thumb is obviously going to be on the white note, you're going to be far back. If you've got a few black notes that you need to be able to reach a little bit further forward, if you're all on the black notes, you'll move forward still. And if you're aware of this, you find yourself slowly, and without noticing it, you're just shifting between the white notes and the black notes quite unthinkingly, as and when you need it. So the next question is from Rita. Now, she's asked some quite detailed questions about Chopin waltz. She says, I would like some insights on how to approach the ornaments in Chopin's Waltz in B minor, B150 Opus Posthumous. This is one that isn't always in all the Chopin waltz books, but it's a beautiful waltz. She asks about the grace notes in measures 18 to 20. I assume you're in America. We talk about bars 18 to 20. And which fingering and finger touch to use to accommodate the decrescendo. I'm not entirely sure what you mean by that, Rita, but I'll answer it as best I can. And then also the trill in the penultimate bar. She's asking about fingering for that. And the student who's working on it is an early intermediate adult student who's eager to sound like an advanced student. I think that's great. Doesn't every intermediate student want to sound advanced? For those of you who don't know which piece I'm talking about, it is this. So it's a lovely waltz. Now, there's this passage which has this. And it's these that Rita is asking about. Now, Rita, there's quite a large number of different fingerings you could use there. And you've probably tried quite a few of them out yourself. And it's impossible without being there with the student to know which one this student is going to find easier and is going to work best. So my advice always with fingering is think yourself of all the various possibilities, and then if necessary give them 2 or 3 and see which one seems to be working immediately, and if that works best, then probably stick with that. Now, the one I would actually personally do is this. Now I've got my 4 there, and I'm just going to do 1, 4, 3. 1, 4, 3. Now that works for me because I combine it with an arm movement, and it's a very fluid arm movement, as you can probably see. So I'm doing this. Now I'm bringing my thumb in. My wrist is pretty high, so that keeps the ornament very light. So I do 1, 4, 3. So it does that high drop. So that fingering works beautifully, and once you've got the right movement, the trill almost sort of plays itself, the ornament plays itself. If the movement doesn't come naturally and they can't quite get it, then I would just go for one of the traditional fingerings, which is, you could do 3, 4. The only trouble is with that, of course, most intermediate students would find a 3, 4 trill very difficult. You could do 3, 5. The fingers are more independent because they're not adjacent, so that might make it a little bit easier. You could bring the hand up and do 1, 3, which is probably at an intermediate level the trill that would feel easier to them. I'm calling it a trill, it's a sort of mini mordant. You could also do 1, 3, 2. Which is a bit like my 1, 4, 3. 1, 3, 2. That is, again, it's another beautiful trill fingering, which any of you, if you haven't used it before, it's a beautiful one to practice because it gives the accent on the main note. You come down onto the main note, so you do 1, 3, 2. So it gives that accent, which means then that you can do that diminuendo following it on from it, Rita. So I think that's what you meant, that you want the phrase to die away. So, sorry, I was forgotten which finger I was doing then. So if we lean on that one, then everything following on from that can die away a little bit. Now, the second part of Rita's question was fingering a trill at the very end. Now, it goes like this. question is how many notes to put into the trill. Now, this is an intermediate student who wants to sound like an advance. So the probably immediate reaction is to play it as fast as they possibly can and try and fit as many notes in as they possibly can. And my question is always, well, how many notes do you think you can realistically do? And if they say 7 or 9, I'll say, well, if you think you can do 7, I would do 5. And for an intermediate student, I would actually only aim to do 5 maximum here. I don't have any wonderfully beautiful fingerings here because we have to get onto the D sharp, and I can see that's why you've got this question in your mind. So I would actually just do that 1, 3, 1, 3, and then 2. And whenever you're teaching an intermediate student to do trills, allow them time. Allow them to practice it really slowly, to feel that they've got all the time in the world, because there's nothing worse than a student feeling in a panic, thinking there's that trill coming up, it's got to be really fast. So if you can see it as something which is very graceful, an enhancement, a decoration of the melody, they'll slowly get it up to speed, and it will still sound very relaxed and comfortable. Now, Martin had a question about hand size and playing the Chopin Etudes. So I think this is for his own playing rather than for any teaching purposes. He says an interesting fact. He says he finds Opus 10 number 2 fits well under his hand, but he finds Opus 10 number 1 very difficult because of the size of his hand. He has some specific questions regarding fingering in Opus 10 number 1, particularly fingerings in bars 22 and 35. I'll come back to that in a minute. Now I find that really interesting, Martin, because I have a very good friend who's an absolutely fantastic pianist and is renowned for having an absolutely superb technique. And when he was younger, he used to say, I never play the whole 48 or 50, 20, sorry, 24 or 27 etudes all in one program, because I find number 2 extraordinarily difficult. And yet you're saying that you don't have difficulty with number 2, but you are having difficulty with number 1. And I think this is very typical of everybody. We all love to sort of have a go at the Chopin etudes. And there are some that we think feel manageable and don't feel too difficult, and some feel absolutely impossible. The 1 in 6, this one, is very, very difficult for me because I don't have a good stretch between 2 and 5. So I've never played the whole set of Chopin etudes, because that one just makes me tired, makes me tense. And so I think why do we practice the Chopin etudes? And I think it's, that we should always see them as a work in progress. They can always be played better. We can always improve them. I don't think we should ever feel, particularly if you're a student or an advanced but not a professional pianist, do not feel that you have to sort of battle against these etudes if you're really struggling with them. I, as an injury specialist, have had too many pianists come to me saying I was practicing this etude for an hour at a stretch every day, and now my hand is hurting. It's many pianists have come to me saying that, including this Opus 10 number 1. So I think we need to take these etudes very carefully and not to overdo it. I often say to my students, if you're short of time, practice 1 page of 6 etudes rather than 6 pages of 1 etude, and you will learn 6 times as much. Because in a way, what I'm doing with my students is I usually just spend huge amounts of time on working on the technique on the first bar or few bars or first phrase. Because once you've understood the technique, once you've got that phrase really comfortable with a very well-balanced technique and with the minimum of effort so you're not exhausting yourself, then you stand a good chance of getting through to page 3 or 4 without getting totally exhausted. Because these studies are very tiring. They do use the same technique most of them, over and over again for several pages. So we need to know when we're actually being able to release the effort so that we don't build up fatigue and tension, and ultimately pain and injury can result from these. So I think it's great, Martin, that you know which ones you find difficult, you know which ones that you want to focus on. And I don't think any of us should feel we've got to be able to play all of them or none of them, or we've got to be able to play all of that particular study, because we're not necessarily learning them in order to be able to perform every piece that we're learning. So you can gain huge amounts from just studying these etudes, perhaps hand separately or at a slower tempo, or as I said, just the first page. There's in every page of these etudes, there's huge amounts to learn, both about sound quality and about technical fluency. So the question you had, first question you had, Martin, was about the stretches in Opus 10, number 1. And here, I think I'm glad we've got the overhead camera so that I can show you what is the most important thing to think about here. Now, I have had 2 professional pianists come to me, or actually, no, college students, who'd hurt their hand as a result of playing this piece. And in both cases, their teacher had said to them, right, there's big stretches in this piece, so you have to stretch your hand out and keep your hand out at a stretch. Now, the stretch here is a 10th, and most pianists can't just reach a 10th. So in a way, even the 2 pianists I'm thinking of both had quite big hands, and they could play this piece, but as soon as they actually felt that they got to hold it at the stretch all the time, they got very, very tired. So, if you analyse this first one, Martin, we start with just thumb on C, right? And at that point, my hand is not out at the stretch. It's quite relaxed. Here, it's closed in. So then I open it out momentarily to get to my second finger. Look what happened to my look what happened to my thumb, it came in, right? Just open out a tiny bit to get to the 4th, and everything has closed in. 5th, and by that point, my thumb has come into position. So that then I open out. So at no point is my hand at a real stretch. 1 to 2 doesn't feel like a big stretch for me. And I'm only at that stretch for a fraction of a second. 2 to 4 isn't a stretch for me. And again, as soon as I've done it, I let it go. 4 to 5, again, I let it go and the thumb is in position. So what happens is that, so I'm not trying to stretch my finger out to reach the note. I'm using my arm to take my finger to the note. So my arm is doing this. So I'm not doing this. I'm not trying to reach out my fingers. So my arm is flowing sideways across the keyboard. To help each finger find its note, because it's so much easier to play any finger when, say I'm playing my 5th finger in that position, that's easy. If I stretch it out and I'm playing it in that position, and then I'm repeating or trying to play it forte, then that becomes very, very tiring, and that's when people get 5th finger hurting. So what I'm also trying to do is to use the arm movement to align the finger. So, thumb is in line with my arm. 2 is in line with my arm. 4 is in line with my arm. 5 is in line with my arm. Thumb's in position. So each finger can play really strongly and confidently because it's just playing straight down. It's not trying to reach the notes and then put the note down, with an accent as well, which is why people get so tired in the 5th finger in this one. Now, your second question was about fingering. And I looked at it and I thought, well, this is very interesting because it fits in with another question that we were talking about earlier on. Because the two bars that you've mentioned, Martin, are the ones where the fifth finger has to play a black note. And I agree, those are very, very awkward bars if you use the normal fingering. So if I'm doing 5, either 4-3 or 3-2, then I have to get my hand round to get my fifth finger there. So there's a lot of twisting and awkwardness involved there. And you remember how I was saying to Gemma, when we're playing C major, the thumb naturally goes on a white note because it's shorter. Similarly, the fifth finger doesn't want to reach onto a black note because it's short. It's much, much shorter than these 3 fingers. So it naturally goes on a white note. So the trouble is, once we try and put the fifth finger onto a black note, which the fingerings that are usually written in here do, then we end up with an awful lot of twisting and replacing of the hand. And it's not surprising that people find that very, very difficult. So I'm going to suggest a fingering for you here, Martin, which avoids that. And you can, I'm sure you can watch this back at some point or just jot down the fingerings quickly as I go through them. So I suggest 5, 4, 3, 1. And then instead of going on to the 5 here, stay with a 1, 3, 1, and then put a 5 on the next note. So that means that this finding the D sharp, instead of having to do that with your fifth finger, you're just doing that, which is much easier. So the only thing that you have to do more of is a quick swishing from side to side to get your fifth into position. So you could practice just that little movement to get really confident with where your fifth finger is going. And similarly, in the other bar, that was bar 22, and here in bar 35, again, this has, in most traditional fingerings, they say put the fifth finger on the black note. So you've got to get a fourth in there amongst the black notes, and then you've got to get back, and it feels awkward. So what I would suggest doing there, Martin, is taking the first A in the left hand, then you've got 1, 2, 4, which is easy, okay? So you've got 1, 2, 4, 2, and then, again, you swish your thumb over it really quickly. In that way. So it cuts out all the stretch, it cuts out the problem of getting that fifth finger onto the black note. It feels much, much easier. So the only thing you have to focus on there is moving your hand really, really quickly to get the thumb in position as you're coming up, or the fifth finger as you're coming down. So I think we're nearly at the end there. I'm just going to, just briefly with the last question from Oliver, who asks, how would you go about introducing your ergonomic fingerings to beginners? Now, in my teacher's course, I think I mentioned that I had a big dilemma here, because when most teachers are teaching scales to beginners, they always start with C major. It's sort of natural, it's easy to just think about the white notes. We're not thinking about where we're going into the black notes. But I think most of you have probably heard that Chopin didn't start with C major, he started with B major. And again, this fits in with what we were talking about, the hand shape, because in C major we have to have a slightly more curled hand shape, whereas with B major, especially for adults and people with bigger hands, it's much, much more comfortable to be playing 4-3-2 on the black note. So it is a much more natural scale to be teaching. As I'm writing my beginner's books, I'm agonizing over how to introduce these fingerings and when to introduce them. And so in fact what I did is I introduced C major and B major. I introduced B major by using the C major fingerings and then saying, no, you can play on the black notes. It's the same fingering, it's very easy. Now, there are some fingerings which I have changed. I mention them everywhere. I wrote a book on fingering many, many years ago as well. And this is summarised in The Complete Pianist. Where I'm trying to use fingerings that fit very well under the hand. So for instance, left hand D major, instead of, if you start with a normal fingering, starting on 5, you get to here, you have to bring your finger over to the white note. And then look, the second finger's not ready. And then I've got to do the same again. And even if you ask quite advanced piano students to play a D major scale, it often doesn't sound very good. It just doesn't sound even. So a much better fingering for that is starting with 2, 1, and then bringing the 4th finger over onto a black note, because the 4th finger is long, and then the 3. And I'd urge you to try that if you haven't tried it before, and try the 2 fingerings, and I'm sure you will find that after you've tried it 2 or 3 times, that this new fingering actually works much better. So I think as a teacher, you can pick and choose. Now, if I was teaching somebody who had never played the D major scale before, I would start with the 2nd finger. They learn it very, very quickly. Children in particular soak things up. Adults will understand why they're doing it. They'll understand the benefits, so they'll want to do it. But if somebody is just coming up to a grade exam, they've been learning, it's a transfer student, they've been learning all the old fingerings for years, I wouldn't then try and persuade them to change their fingering at the last minute. So whenever I'm teaching a scale fingering to any student, I'm always, if there's a scale that comes up, a scalic passage in a piece of music, then I will always aim to give them the best possible fingering for that piece of music. And if we can introduce those fingerings as early as possible, then obviously they develop a hand feel for it, a sort of muscle memory, they understand the fingerings, they remember them better. So as far as I'm concerned, the earlier the better. So I think that's all for today. I hope we'll do another Q&A session in the future. If any of you have put any questions in the chat, we'll hopefully be able to address those on a future occasion. Thank you for joining me. Bye.